Indie horror, and more so mascot horror, has been a lot more mainstream over the years. Mascot horror being horror games that have a strong focus on their cartoony, recognizable character. This has been very prevalent following the massive success of Five Nights at Freddy's, primarily. You got literal mascots as the face of the show, and they guaranteed the game to be easy to recognize and easy to brand. Following this, you got Bendy with Bendy, Baldies with Baldy, Spookies with Spooky, the cast of Doki Doki, and most infamously with Poppy Playtime, with Huggy Wuggy and Mommy Longlegs later on. However, there is a big one that I have left out of that list. It's not as well known as all of those these days, but it's absolutely iconic and certainly influential in its own right. Today I want to discuss one of the horror classics of the 2010s, Tattletail. Tattletail was a massive game online when it was released in 2016. It had everything needed to be big on YouTube, realistically. It had a recognizable cartoon character for the face of the brand, it was deemed legitimately scary by most players, and although it wasn't aesthetically outstanding or anything, it definitely stood out amongst the sea of indie horror games of the time. This was also before what I referred to as mascot horror was basically every horror game ever, so the iconic character was, in my opinion, essential to the game's success. Today I want to take a look back at Tattletail and see how well it holds up realistically. There are many games that have since followed in its footsteps, and its influence is pretty irrefutable, but how good of a game is it by itself after 6 years? Because, like I said, the type of game that Tattletail is has become a lot more commonplace, and I personally find it interesting to think about how the game feels after all this time given how much has changed. The first thing I want to discuss is the concept and premise of the game itself, because although this may be unfortunate, I do feel like we're running out of space for innovation in gaming in a lot of ways. When it comes to the field of horror games, mainly indie horror games, the gameplay itself, and at times even the story, is realistically not that different from a lot of other games that came before it. It's more about the presentation of the content and the experience that comes along with it. Did Poppy Playtime rip off Bendy in quite a few ways? If you say no, you are quite unintelligent. However, they still feel very distinct because of their presentation. Is Spookies a game where you do anything besides walk forward? Absolutely not. However, it's the incredible presentation that makes the game something extremely distinct. I think FNAF being something different is actually the reason it was successful. I don't think FNAF is stylistically distinct like Bendy or Spookies, but its gameplay was pretty separate from everything coming out at the time, and that was really exciting. Not to say FNAF 1 doesn't have style or an interesting premise, but the lack of movement and exploration and the focus on point-and-click mechanics was something much more distinct than anything the game had to offer besides maybe the cast of characters. Basically what I'm getting at is, Tattletail realistically doesn't actually have that much room to innovate, nor do most games. It's really depressing. But the whole concept of Tattletail is how you can make things different. The whole concept of Tattletail is you are a child that is being haunted by a fucking Furby. It's not just a Furby, but it's very obviously based on the Furby. You received this toy as a gift for Christmas, and like a sneaky child, opened the gift early, and you're now cursed or something. I don't really understand what the lore would be. The actual Tattletail toy that you received is completely innocent, but once you've opened the gift, you are haunted by the Mama Tattletail. This concept itself I actually like more than a lot of others we've discussed for various reasons. The big part of this idea that I appreciate is it sets the game in the setting of the protagonist's own home. This is also something I've always liked about FNAF 4, for example. The game feels a lot more unsettling when you set it in one place where you're meant to feel safest. A haunted pizzeria or a haunted toy factory is still creepy because it's haunted, but you can just, not go there. You experienced one night at Freddy's. I don't quite understand why you would return to the second, third, and so on.
The first night. If I didn't want to stay the first night, why would I stay any more than 5? Why would I stay any more than 2? Hello.
I like when a horror game takes place entirely on your own property because it locates you where you should have the utmost control, yet you have none. Another thing I like about this idea is that the protagonist is a child. If you take that out of context, I will murder you. What I like about the protagonist of a horror game being a child is that it makes it even more unsettling and uncomfortable when you are constantly conscious of the innocence of a child. This does apply to other games as well, once again FNAF 4 being one of them. Technically this applies to Security Breach, but I want nothing more than to brutally slaughter Gregory, so it doesn't really have the same effect when I want the child to die. I'll let you decide if I'm joking or not. In the case of Tattletail, you are literally just a small child that was simply so excited to open their Christmas gift, but now you are stuck in this ridiculous hell. You aren't reminded of this throughout the game, which I actually think could have been something done better, but the start of the game is just opening your present, wrapping it back up, and getting back to bed before anyone finds out. This is such an obvious and distinct childlike thing to do, and to me that is again a reminder that this is just a kid that was excited about opening up their presents, and it makes everything that happens afterwards borderline devastating. So this concept I find really good and interesting until I explain what the actual threat of the game is, because like I mentioned, the little purple Tattletail is completely innocent. Mama Tattletail is the big bad, and the entire premise of this is handled so poorly that I am genuinely convinced the developers were on some sort of drugs when they planned the conclusion of the game. The main gameplay in Tattletail is completing tasks while avoiding making too much noise. If you make too much noise, then Mama Tattletail will kill you. This by itself is fine, but again, the conclusion to this game is horrendous. Your final few tasks are preparing a ritual for a group of Tattletails to banish Mama from existence, I guess? The great majority of this game is pretty creepy. I'll discuss the horror a bit more later, but like I said, the premise is already unsettling and the presentation is solid as well. However, this very idea is so goofy and stupid that it genuinely feels like a different game. It is such an insane change in tone that I cannot even comprehend. Mama Tattletail is a totally fine antagonist, and the mechanics to avoid her are also fine for the most part, but this ritual segment that is the big conclusion to this famous game is just so stupid. So overall, the concept of Tattletail is pretty good, it's fairly unique, it definitely doesn't feel too comparable to other mascot horror games, and it's interesting and engaging, which should be the main goal of the concept itself. I just think the conclusion is really bad and kind of butchers a lot of what made the rest of it good, but I guess it's forgivable. Aside from the concept, I'd also like to dedicate some time to exploring the gameplay a bit more. I won't spend too much time on this because Tattletail is like an hour in length, and it obviously doesn't fit a wide variety of mechanics into that time, but it's still worth discussing because this is a video game. They are generally meant to game. The gameplay is where most of my critiques of Tattletail come in. Once again, I actually quite enjoy the concept of the game, and the presentation is totally solid as well, but the gameplay isn't exactly the best. I wouldn't describe Tattletail as a walking simulator necessarily, but I would describe it as a game where you really just need to be able to read. There's really no skill involved, it's either reading comprehension or complete luck. Because the gameplay mostly consists of go from here to there to there to there to there, and nothing really gets in the way, except, of course, for when Mama Tattletail is an obstacle. This is where I feel like it's basically luck-based. Mama Tattletail drains your light and appears at random. It may not be random, but I haven't been able to spot any sort of pattern or consistency, and you have to stay out of her sight while also remaining silent. One of the main mechanics that I haven't mentioned is keeping Tattletail's stats up while it's with you. If you have Tattletail with you, you have to keep him charged, fed, and groomed. If any of these stats reach 0, it screams like crazy. And as you may assume, Mama don't like the screaming too much. Now, tell me what you do when Tattletail is about to run out of a stat, and Mama is right where you have to go, and Tattletail starts screaming before Mama has the chance to disappear. I'm asking because I have no idea, and this can very easily happen. It's made even worse by Tattletail being afraid of the dark. Your flashlight makes noise when you charge it, but when it's not charged, Tattletail freaks out and makes noise anyway. So if you're in a position where Mama is nearby and you're almost out of light, what do you do? If you charge the flashlight, you die. If you don't, you die. I feel like there must be a way out of this because I am horrendous at games, but I just don't see it. A theoretically good way to get out of that is running out of Mama's field of view and then charging the flashlight, but running makes noise, so the timing of that when walking is obscene. Like, if you're slowly walking away and Tattletail is about to start screaming, you're probably not going to make it anyway. It's also just so hard to see where you're even going when it's pitch black, but if I lighten the room, I die. The game is easy generally speaking, but there are positions you can be put in that I am apparently too stupid to get out of. But again, nothing is worse than the very last sequence. This essentially acts as a final boss fight to get rid of Mama Tattletail for good, like I said, and it is just so horrendous. The final boss takes place after Mama Tattletail thwarts the Tattletail's plans to banish her with a ritual. I do not have the time or care to explain that shit in depth. Mama Tattletail steals all the candles being used in the ritual and puts them in vases, I guess. You need to break the vases around the place until you find all the candles. The challenge of the game is meant to be avoiding Mama Tattletail, since breaking a vase makes noise, and so does shaking your light. The challenge of the game ends up being doing literally anything. The room is too dark to see anything, and shaking your light basically kills you instantly because Mama Tattletail is always close by because the room is overly fucking small. I despise this sequence. It, once again, feels entirely luck-based. You have to hope and pray that Mama Tattletail doesn't trap you in a corner that you can't get out of. You also have to hope and pray that you have X-ray vision. This place is so fucking dark, and you never have the fucking chance to use your flashlight. I replayed this game to get better footage, and I chose not to finish the game because this section sucks so bad. It is the most frustrating shit I've ever been made to endure. Anyway, let's talk scary stuff. Is Tattletail scary? There's definitely a lot holding it back, but as far as mascot horror games goes, it does a pretty good job. It's scarier than Bendy 1 and 2, Poppy Playtime Chapter 1 and 2, and Spookies combined, so that's something. The general atmosphere and environment of the game is pretty top-notch. As I mentioned, the setting being a home works really well to amplify the stressfulness of the experience. It's a really simple and almost obvious detail given the concept, but it just adds a lot because of, once again, the illusion of the familiarity and comfort of home being completely broken. The lighting of the environment is also pretty solid. It's not so dark that it makes practically no sense, but it's just dark enough to make the game a little more unsettling. Nothing is too clear, so there's fear of the unknown and the disturbing sense of mystery, but unlike the final boss segment, it isn't so dark that you can't see. The main threat, Mama Tattletail, has probably aged the worst out of everything in this game. Her design is just kind of shit, although I will admit I can't really describe why it's shit. It's just closer to ugly than scary. And the jump scare, though it may not be much worse than most jump scares in games, it's still not a great jump scare. It's overly predictable, the animation is pretty dumb looking despite the rest of the game being of solid quality, and this weird thing where the background becomes static just doesn't really make sense to me at all. And as I said, the final sequence kind of ruins the rest of the game with its sheer stupidity. I could somewhat appreciate the stupidity in a comedic sense, but with the rest of the game being a pretty decent horror game, this is just embarrassing. It's like if FNAF 3's final minigame was completely replaced with a scene of Springtrap doing Fortnite dances. That might be a slight exaggeration, but only a slight one. Tattletail is fairly scary for the great majority of its playtime, but it's still very much imperfect. Mama's presence with her glowing red eyes in the dark is pretty decent, but her actual design and jump scare are both pretty horrendous. And the conclusion to the experience is easily the worst part of the experience, like I've said many times. However, the rest of the game does a solid job at building suspense and frightening the player. So we've looked at the major elements of Tattletail's design as a game. There have been a few details I've left out, but we've covered the important stuff. So does it hold up after 6 whole years? Surprisingly, it does. But is that even a good thing? I really hate to say this, but I think Tattletail holds up in the sense that it's pretty on par with what has followed in its footsteps. It's just as, or even more scary, it's on a similar level of quality when it comes to its visuals and presentation, it has an equally iconic mascot character, and its gameplay is surprisingly similar to the games that follow it. But again, that's actually pretty depressing, because the reason this game holds up so well is because it has so little competition that isn't bland and uninteresting. The great majority of indie horror titles that blew up after Tattletail did are worse than Tattletail in almost every way. The only thing Tattletail doesn't do as well as the new mascot horror games is lure in the player with a complicated story. But again, that's actually something I like about it. Now, don't get me wrong, Tattletail has lore, and I'm sure it's more complicated than my understanding of it. However, it doesn't rely on its complex writing to engage people, which new indie titles absolutely do. Overall, I'd give Tattletail a solid 6 to a 6.5 out of 10, and I'd say it does hold up. It's a decent experience and not a bad time if you're a horror fan. It has a fairly long list of flaws given its 1 hour playtime, however, it's fairly scary, it's an interesting idea, it's an overall pleasant experience despite its flaws. So that was the Tattletail retrospective, technically. It was nice to make a video on something that wasn't FNAF, so if there are any other indie horror games that you want me to cover, let me know. I also covered Spookies in my last video with the homie Pastra. You should check that out. There are already a few more on the way that aren't FNAF related, but still let me know what you want to see on the channel moving forward for the new year. Also, let me know how you feel about Tattletail. Is it too boring? Is it really thrilling? Are you in the middle and fairly indifferent? Feel free to let me know. Thank you so much for watching this video. Reminder that you can become a channel member to receive exclusive content and extra perks for a very low cost. You can also follow me on Instagram and Twitter at I'mTheBaddest. Links are in the description. Thank you for watching once again. I'll see you guys next time.